talk in this next session about those people that everybody else has said nobody wants to talk about, and that's people who can't afford to save for retirement. To help us do that, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Maya Rockeymoore. She is a friend of NPF. She's been a speaker for us a number of times before. She's quite the expert on this topic. She is the president and CEO of Global Policy Solutions and also president of the Center for Global Policy Solutions, and maybe she'll explain the nuance of how those things are related. Previously, she's been Vice President of Research and Programs for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. She has spent time on the Hill, Chief of Staff to Congressman Charlie Rangel. She's been part of the House Ways and Means Committee staff. At this point, she is a very well-known economic security expert. She talks about the racial wealth gap, financial literacy, Social Security, and the importance of maintaining that Social Security program, particularly its essential nature for certain populations. She chairs the board of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. She has testified before Congress. She's been part of thought leader groups at the White House. And so I'm really happy to have you here with us today, and I'm looking forward to hearing your speech.
Thank you, Linda. It's always a pleasure to actually come and talk to this group because it's always very engaging. And usually I'm representing a perspective that's not usually discussed. And so I'm actually using this dialogue today as preparation for tomorrow. I'm testifying on the Senate side, Senate Finance Committee on the Social Security Subcommittee on this very topic of retirement security. And so, shoot at me because I'm going to treat some of you all like Republicans. Just consider me a hostile witness.
Just talk endlessly and then ask you a question.
That's right.
And Maya, just clarifying, we are on the record here.
Okay.
And it's okay for these guys to write, quote, tweet.
Okay. No, yeah. We're on the record. And if at any point we're off the record, can I do that?
You'll have to ask them.
Okay. So I will negotiate with you as we go through this. I've gotten some questions that were politically sensitive in the past that I have asked to suppress, but I like to engage in a dialogue that's free-floating, and pretty much everything, I'm pretty transparent. I think that the affiliations that I've had, it's clear the perspective that I bring to this. Just a brief word about my background. My folks are from the South. They grew up in Jim Crow era Texas. On my mother's side, I'm just the fourth generation from slavery. Just imagine that, some households, there are 4 generations in one household living together. But on my mother's side, it hasn't been a very long experience. When I come to these issues, I bring the perspective of people without, because I come from a family who has been without. And I see people every day who are without. And when I look at the statistics, I see the statistics through the lens of those who are without. And I bring this passion and this perspective because I think it very much needs to be a part of the national policy conversation, because I think that we as a society can be better. I think that we as a society, we have done things throughout history that have shown that as a society we can actually come together to have a greater vision of what we can be. And there are reasons why I think that we need to actually continue to press forward and not regress. And I'll be discussing that today. Yesterday, and I'm sorry I stole your report, but I'll give it to you by the end of the... I didn't bring enough. Yesterday we released this full report. It's called Beyond Broke: Why Closing the Racial Wealth Gap is a Priority for National Economic Security. The full report is actually on our website, but this is the executive summary. The Miami Herald, they actually did a story on this yesterday that looked at some of the demographic data. National Journal has covered it. We've gotten coverage in the Washington Post. And some other very good coverage. And so I thought that I would start this year. I usually have another kind of presentation that I just refresh every year. I thought that I would present the results of the study and then add on the retirement security lens and have the conversation from there. So with that, just a little bit about who we are. I guess you've been seeing this. So I run Global Policy Solutions, which is a social change strategy firm that works on issues of health, education, economic security. Basically, on the consulting side, we're a policy shop for hire. We work with like-minded organizations to really push the needle on policy analysis, research, and program design. But on the nonprofit side, the Center for Global Policy Solutions, we're a think tank and do tank. And yesterday, as I mentioned, we released this report, and we do a lot around health, economic security, and education. And we believe that, we can overcome, the challenges, the structural challenges that we face as a nation, and that we have a responsibility as a society to do so. And so, with that, we educate and empower change agents, such as yourself. We advance systemic change for those who need it. We are unapologetically advocates, particularly those for the vulnerable. And we develop targeted and effective solutions. We believe in targeted strategies for actually closing oftentimes historically derived disparities and policy-initiated disparities. And so often, our approach to this is through the lens of what we call targeted universalism, that we can actually have universal policies that touch all people, but there need to be targeted levers within those policies that actually address specific issues facing specific populations. And I'll be happy to engage in that conversation later. And so with this, we have worked for the past 8.5 years on an initiative funded by the Ford Foundation called Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. And this has been fundamental. You will not find it in Piketty. Is it Piketty or Piketty? Piketty? Does anybody know?
Ubiquitous.
Has anybody read the Piketty book? I understand it's like this long and big. And I'm going to buy it and I'm going to read it. But I haven't read it yet. But I'm pretty darn sure that Piketty has not actually done an analysis of the wealth gap by race and ethnicity. If he would, has anybody seen the movie by former Treasury Secretary?
Yeah.
What?
Inequality for All.
Yeah, Inequality for All. You saw it?
Yeah.
So what Piketty and what's his name?
Robert
Reich is talking about is this era of inequality in America. How just prior to the Great Depression in the United States, we saw obscene levels of wealth inequality in this nation. And then after the Great Depression, going after the wars, you see those levels of inequality dropping. And then you see them, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now you see them rising again. And so that we are now at the same level of wealth inequality that the robber barons and the titans that some would argue, contributed to the crash. Actually had pre-Great Depression. And so that U-chart, the economists call it, looks like one of the dips in the Golden Gate Bridge, okay? So we're back at high levels of inequality. What Piketty and you won't ever read in the mainstream news media and what we're trying to point out in this report and elsewhere is that all that movement along the wealth continuum has been among white people in this nation. Me either, I guarantee you. But somebody's doing well.
Just right down there.
That's right. And this is important for a number of reasons. It's important because, for 188, if you consider 1964, and, as you all know, this is the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If you consider that the point at which we included people of color in our formal economy, and arguably you can say that might have been the point, then for 80% of our nation's 238 years of existence, we have officially excluded these populations from full participation in the U.S. economy. And we are still experiencing the ramification of that structural exclusion today. And I'm about to show you what it looks like. So, as I mentioned, we released a report. And notice that we're not focusing on income. We're focusing on wealth. And the reason why we're focusing on wealth, because this is the story of wealth. Income is an important part of the wealth equation, but so are other assets. And assets, as you well know, are what establishes economic security for a family. And not just for a family at one point in time, but throughout generations. If you have assets in the family and you're able to pass it down to generations, it makes the next generation better off, and they're able to, and it compounds over time. And so when you're talking about who has and who hasn't, it's often a story about generational wealth. And that is why I bring in history, because history has, in this case, through official policies of government, created structural situations where you literally have significant parts of the population by race and ethnicity who have no generational wealth, and it's quite striking. And so when you look at this first statistic, you will see disparity in liquid wealth. The liquid wealth, and everybody knows what liquid wealth is that's your cash assets or your or assets that you can readily turn into cash. We have huge disparities in this country when it comes to liquid wealth. African Americans, when you're looking at liquid wealth, and these are average numbers, but African Americans had a median liquid wealth of only $200, and these are U.S. Census Bureau statistics, SIP, Survey of Income and Program Participation, 2011 data.
Is this adults or is this total?
These are adults, and so they had a median liquid wealth of only $200, compared to $23,000 held by whites and $19,500 held by Asians, $340 held by Latinos. While the overall wealth gap remains stunning, it really is important to understand that when you take retirement assets out of the equation, the liquid wealth of African Americans is only a mere $25, and Latinos $100 compared to $3,000 held by whites. And really, it's just really a striking finding that literally, when you're talking about African American and Latino communities especially, you're talking about communities that are disproportionately liquid asset poor. Meaning that, yeah.
I'm sorry, is this median or
Median,
average?
median,
Okay.
median.
Thank you.
Liquid asset poor. These are households that are hanging on by their fingernails on the edge of the economy. And liquid asset poor, the formal definition of that is that these households will not be able to make it for 3 months without having, for example, if they got fired from a job, they wouldn't be able to make it 3 months without being just destitute and dependent on other sources of other resources. And so with that, it's important to realize that cash and the ability to liquidate anything into cash is a problem for these communities. And so it's also important to note that these households, there are disparities in terms of the amount of tangible assets. With white households, the most likely to have tangible or financial assets. And with African American and Latino households, the least likely to have tangible assets.
What sorts of things are we talking about?
Yeah. Next slide.
Oh, okay.
So tangible assets, homes, cars, other motor vehicles, financial assets, checking accounts, retirement accounts. And so you really see, these huge disparities in terms of who has what with regards to wealth. Now, when we're talking about financial assets, you see that whites and Asians are most likely to have checking accounts compared to Latinos, who 60% have checking accounts, and African Americans, 55% of whom have checking accounts. But look at these retirement account numbers. It's pretty sad. That when you're looking at who actually owns retirement accounts, 58% of whites do in this case. African Americans, 32%. Latinos, 28%. Access, or actually not access, but who owns a retirement account. And so, that's a critical disparity that we'll be getting into more later. So what many people also don't realize is the effect of the Great Recession on households of color. This is the 2005 through 2009 numbers in terms of median net worth, and these are the 2009 through 2011 numbers. Between 2005 and 2009, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos lost more than half of their net worth, compared to only 12% of whites. Okay? And look, for Latinos, it was 65% of their median net worth was lost. And a lot of this driver, and I'll be talking about this shortly, was mixed up in the housing situation. It wasn't just unemployment; it was also what happened with the housing market. Now these numbers got better. You see them slightly. Oh, by the way, you see them slightly recovering. Now they're coming out of a deep hole. By 2011, you see them slightly recovering, with actually, interestingly enough, with whites actually experiencing a slight loss. But these numbers mean that despite what you're hearing from the Survey of Consumer Finance, because the Federal Reserve has put out a report in the last year or so saying, oh, households actually regained all of the wealth that they actually lost from the Great Recession. That's BS. It's not true. And the data actually shows that many households, especially households of color, are still struggling to even try to dig out of the hole that resulted from,
Well, these are median figures,
Yeah.
and the Federal Reserve measures aggregate. So are we seeing the 1% or the 1/10 of 1%?
So this is the
figures?
issue with the Federal Reserve. When they're putting out that data, they're not talking about. I mean, when you use aggregate data, I mean, it could all be the 1%.
Yeah.
Who's accrued that, but it sounds like, all the households have regained the wealth. And this is the real story. All the households have not regained their wealth.
Yeah.
And in fact, that 1% could have regained all the wealth, and they're telling us everybody's recovered. Well, that's not true. So this is the finding that we have actually highlighted the most in terms of our report. And that is, for every $1 in wealth held by the typical white family, the typical African American family owns 6 cents, and the typical Latino family owns 7 cents. Now, in order to drive this home for folks, this is what I have to tell you. These are, these are certainly median numbers, but they show you the deep racial disparities that we have in this country when it comes to wealth, and it really is striking. Now, what's striking about the Asian story is that there are two things happening with Asians. Prior to 2005, they were actually doing better than whites. They had $1.24, but look at the huge drop by 2009. 68 cents for every dollar of held by whites. And so, I'm sorry, 2009, and then by 2011, you see them regaining. But it's interesting. The story about Asians, and it takes working with Asian Pacific American advocates to know the story, is that there are just a few subpopulations who are driving those big numbers for the Asian groups. But if you look at populations like the Hmong and some of these other subpopulations within the Asian groups, they are struggling. Yet they find it very difficult to get over what they call this model minority myth, that all Asians are doing well. But you dig below the surface and you find out that not all Asians are doing well, but you have a subset who are just basically skewing the numbers, busting the curve for everybody else, if you will. Yeah. Did I see a hand? No?
Well,
Okay.
I was just curious if they maybe were affected by the how that you said by.
I'm about to tell that story.
Okay.
I actually have a question.
Oh,
In the
sure.
subsets in
I'm
the
sorry.
Hispanics, did you break up?
We did not. Actually, this is not true. As a part of the study that we released yesterday, we did a 4-city analysis. And that is what the Miami Herald actually covered. If you give me your card, I'll forward you the story. You got it. Oh, you have it. Yeah, so that's not true. We did a 4-city analysis. Miami was one of them, Tulsa, Oklahoma, we did Los Angeles, and we did Washington, D.C. And our effort to do that was the national data doesn't tell a subgroup story. you can't tell what's happening with these subpopulations. And we wanted to go to the census tract level to actually understand the differences, not only between groups, but actually within groups. And so that coverage, the Miami story, tells what's happening with Haitians, what's happening with various population groups. Within the Latino community, it was broken out by certain subpopulations. And so it tells that story. Cuban Americans were covered in the Miami story. And in our report, you will see an entire section that looks at the variations within racial and ethnic groups, and that's a story. And actually, this has never been done before. So it was only a 4-state pilot, a 4-city pilot, but it was important for us to be able to kind of uplift the richness and the diversity in terms of the differences within groups as well as among groups. So this is really a story of, in many respects, a story of home ownership. And what you will see is that in terms of median equity of homes, the biggest loss between 2005 and 2011 was experienced by Latinos and Asians. And the reason why that was so is that they were more likely to live in states where there was a crisis with regards to the subprime lending mortgage crisis. And interestingly enough, so 41% of Asians and 43% of Latinos lived in a mortgage crisis state. And so what happens is when the bubble crashed, their home values plummeted, and they had a significant exposure, taking their wealth with it, if not their homes. As you know, there are high rates of foreclosure in these communities as well, particularly African American and Latino communities. Interestingly enough, African Americans were less likely to live in crisis states, but their home ownership rates declined, and the number of African Americans who are actually underwater is the highest out of any racial and ethnic group. We think that that's a story combined with what happened to African American unemployment as a result of the Great Recession. They had the highest levels of unemployment, and so your ability to pay a mortgage is almost nil if you're beyond broke and you don't have a job. All right, so so this issue of retirement is something that it's just fascinating to me to go to the cocktail parties and to talk to particularly wealthy people about this whole issue of Social Security, about retirement. It's always curious to me to hear people talking who don't necessarily have a perspective on the entire population. They have their own lens. But the fact of the matter is that half of the U.S. population doesn't even have access to a employer-provided retirement account. And then when you look at this by race and ethnicity, it gets pretty stunning. This is actually just access. Do you work in a job that actually gives you access to a tax-preferred retirement vehicle? Look at Latinos. Only 38% of Latinos actually work on a job that actually even gives them access to a retirement account. Now, this is a story of, and then this story tells you, even if you have access, you have a problem with people actually enrolling in that retirement account as well. So this is the differential. If you got access, are you participating? Got access, are you participating? So this tells two stories here. But the issue of access is critically important because, when you're talking about retirement security in this country, realizing that about half of the population doesn't have access, then you have to understand that Social Security is all they got. Social Security is all they got. And so, we will not be doing ourselves any favor as a nation by talking about cutting Social Security benefits or privatizing the system and laying the risk on individuals who have nothing else. Social Security is all they have. And the story is even getting worse, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. This is racial disparities and workplace retirement plan access are greater in the private sector than in the public sector. So the green is the private sector. You see that that you know, you have these disparities in access to retirement plans. But look at the public sector. There's relative, I mean, whites are still significantly ahead, 83%, but there's more parity.
I'm astonished that it's not 99 or 100%. I mean, I can't think of a public sector enterprise anywhere that doesn't have a retirement plan.
Yeah, well, this is
What states
the
don't?
data.
What states don't have?
This is the data. And so this is the CPS. Yeah, this is it. This is the data.
Wow.
Yeah. And so with that, you see that, you know, if you're in the private sector, you know, there are significant disparities in access. If you're in the public sector, there's more parity. This is not, to me, I mean, this is important to understand, but also it's a story that we need to continue to keep an eye on because what's happening is that many public sector workers and states and localities are actually saying and arguing that they can't afford the pension liabilities. Yeah.
Right. Okay. We were wondering what CPS, the data.
Where does the data
Yeah.
come
what
So
is
this
it
is from NERS. What is NERS? The national. They just released this report 2 months ago. CPS is actually also a part of census. I can look it up right quick. So I took this from NERS. This is not from our study. Anybody got Google? Who's got Google? current population survey. Since U.S. Census Bureau current population survey.
And you know what ASAP is? So that's
Look
all
it up.
part of, that's all part of the. But this is all from the census. What I'm
Yeah,
asking.
this is from census.
This is all from census.
This is census, and this was produced by NIRS, the National Income Retirement Security. They basically produced this report about 2 months ago. So I just basically just lifted their slide. So this is important, but this is also important because what do we know about what's happening with states and localities? They're actually talking about going to a defined contribution system, which is what the private sector has done in terms of 401ks, which is arguably done a disservice to private sector workers because, as you well know, the data shows that 401ks are underfunded significantly when it comes to what people actually need in retirement.
But
So
that would not
Defined
change
benefit.
these numbers, because a 401k would still be considered a tax.
That would not change these numbers.
Right. I understand the argument
yeah.
about.
Right. But it would change the retirement security picture. And arguably, for me, I think that it would increase reliance if the public sector goes by the way that the private sector has, in terms of defined contribution plans, that is arguably going to increase reliance on, well, we'll see. I'm making this argument tomorrow. But it's going to increase public pressure because you're going to have public sector workers who don't have sufficient resources for retirement. And as you well know, many states and localities are not a part of the Social Security system, which means that they won't have Social Security to rely on.
Right.
Now, there are some people arguing right now that we need to bring all state and local workers into the Social Security system. I think that there's going to be increased pressure to actually do that in the future if that trend towards defined contribution or hybrids that reduce the defined benefit security continue into the future. And then some, this is actually, oh gosh, I lost the resource in the translation. I'm so sorry, I was running late. I can get you the resource. This was from a Rico Chang's study that actually looked at racial differences in wealth by gender. And what you see here is that that white married couples have a significant amount of wealth. If you look at single men, you understand that white men are doing better than black and Hispanic women. If you're looking at single women, black and Latino women aren't even on the chart. And I can get you that data. I'm sorry that it was lost in translation. And then this is the trend in terms of, you've probably seen this already, but this is the rise of defined contribution, 401ks, the decline of pensions, defined benefit plans, and then this is where we are in terms of hybrids. And the reality is that, there's a big argument, as I mentioned, that defined contributions have actually increased retirement insecurity in this nation. So, why does race matter? Why does race matter? Anybody want to tell me why race matters? I don't mind talking about race. We are in an environment, even though we're 50 years beyond, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we are in an environment where it is increasingly, the dialogue is increasingly negative about actually bringing up race. But it's important to actually discuss race and ethnicity because it tells a story. In fact, we would be irresponsible if we did not discuss race and ethnicity, because then you would miss big pieces of the story. Take the mortgage crisis. Income alone did not explain what happened in the subprime mortgage crisis. You had African Americans earning more than $200,000 who were getting targeted for subprime mortgage loans at twice the rate of whites who are earning less than $50,000. Income didn't tell the story. You had to actually look at race in order to understand the dynamic. Same thing with, let me pick another issue. This is something I always argue because you also have liberal think tanks who think that you can tell an entire story by income or gender. And oftentimes it's the intersectionality of income, race, and gender, or the intersectionality of class, race, and gender that gives you the richer story, the real story. I work on childhood obesity issues and another, outside of retirement security. As I mentioned, we do health and education. If you didn't look at race, you would miss a critical part of the story. Across for African Americans, obesity is an issue across income levels. But it's not necessarily the case for whites. So, race is it is important and imperative that as journalists, you're looking at all of the variables that can tell the story. And that is your job. So I encourage you that despite the public pressure not to, engage in these issues, that it's a critical part of the story.
When we were looking at the data regarding access to retirement and assets, and both financial and tangible and things like that, are there differences between cultures in their attitudes about saving and retirement? How does that factor? Is that part of the story too?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, I started out by telling you that I'm the fourth generation from slavery. Do you think that anybody in my family was talking about saving for retirement? My grandparents had a 5th and 6th grade education. My parents were the first generation to actually graduate from high school and then go on to college. Yet they didn't get any information from their families about financial management. And so, you have differentials in terms of who has even education and knowledge about financial education and management, because we don't provide it in our school system. This is not something that we provide in our school system. It's the family unit that actually transfers that kind of knowledge and culture down through the generations. And there are some family units that have been more advantaged in that area than others for historical reasons. So we can't blame it on culture writ large. We have to understand.
I'm not suggesting.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. I wonder if that's a factor, and that if you do make it more accessible, how don't you then need to sort of educate?
We actually call for actually adding financial literacy and education to the formal K through 12 education structure. Okay. That is one of our recommendations. And we also add entrepreneurship. Now that, Voc Ed, Remember, Shop, they're now calling it career and technical education. We actually think that this needs to be a part of age appropriate as they go along the school system. But, that and entrepreneurship need to be a part of the educational experience, because you have differences in terms of familial knowledge about these things. Okay? So how many of you know that of every baby born today in America, a majority are from racial and ethnic minority groups?
Yeah, we've discussed a little bit of that.
How many of you know by the year 2019, the majority of the kids under the age of 18 will be from racial and ethnic minority groups? By the year 2019. 2019, that's a few short years. And then, of course, the Census Bureau projects that by the year 2043, the nation's majority population will be either African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, with Latinos driving the demographic shift. Latinos followed by Asians. And so I've already explained that these households are at the margins of the economy. They don't have much wealth. And they don't have, have less access to retirement security through employers. And they're heavily reliant already on Social Security. So the issue of the nation's changing demographics, we argue, should be considered a national economic security issue if you're thinking about the future of this nation. But it's also important, increases the importance of why we need to be paying attention to Social Security. And I've already made that argument once. But as you all well know, the Old Age and Survivor Disability Insurance Trust Fund, otherwise known as Social Security, are scheduled to actually have a drop in their financial picture in a few short years. And with that, the issue of what happens in terms of how we actually solve the challenge of addressing Social Security's financing issues matters. It's critical to communities of color. It's critical to the nation, frankly, not just communities of color. And the policy options matter. With that, oops, sorry. With that, it's important to understand how different populations use Social Security. There's a reason why when we think Social Security, we think retirement. Because the majority population has literally almost 72% rely on Social Security for retirement, almost exclusively. But look at this for African Americans. Now, unfortunately, Social Security, his data is still other, which is a bad thing. We don't know what these other groups are. But they're similar in terms of using the full spectrum of Social Security's various benefits. Social Security is not just a retirement insurance program. It is a survivor insurance program, and it's a disability insurance program. Can anybody tell me why African Americans, for example, would be more likely to depend on survivor and disability benefits?
Because black men die so young.
That's right. You have a situation where the life expectancy for African Americans is shorter. They die, they leave dependent survivors behind, and those dependent survivors are using Social Security survivor benefits. The retirement system is very important for African Americans and other Americans, but so are Social Security's disability and survivor benefits. Now, I've already given you the picture in terms of the racial wealth disparities, and what you can see here is that how this translates into reliance on Social Security for 90% or more of the income in retirement. And you see that Latinos and African Americans, more so than whites, have a very significant rely on Social Security for 90%. More than half of Latinos and almost half of African Americans rely on it for 90% or more of their retirement security in retirement. Now, I'm bringing this to you because I think that it's important that I explain how I think of the asset picture. And that is that, you have folks who are arguing that Social Security isn't important. I think I've told you why Social Security is important. But we need to understand how Social Security fits into the entire picture of asset building in America. And so what I've developed is this thing called an asset house. And to me, this is the concept of how we should be thinking about how all of these pieces of the puzzle fit together. When people are talking about asset building, they're just usually talking about this small part of the puzzle. You know, do you have real estate? Do you own a business? Do you have a retirement account? That's the personal assets. But those personal assets come on top of all of these other things. And so when you're talking about foundational kinds of assets, Social Security or social insurance in general is a foundational asset. It's important. It helps society and workers actually mitigate the risks that would undermine family security and actually societal security. Citizenship is an asset. Quality public education is an asset. Healthcare is an asset. Social interest is a very important foundational asset that we, fortunately, as a society, have determined that we need. And for, in Social Security's case, we've used for 79 years to great effect. But at the first level of the house, we have the policies upon which we encourage and build encourage asset building in our nation. So, the tax structure has been used as an asset building policy. Education incentives, health incentives, employment policies and incentives are policies that help communities build assets. At the second level of the house, we see that there are community assets as well. And these are the kinship networks. How many of you actually inherited money from your parents or your grandparents? So a couple of you. There was an article, I think the National Journal article, and the title was, "If you received an inheritance, you're probably white." But we tend not to think about community assets like kinship networks or community nonprofits or faith and financial institutions that are rooted in communities. And then at the top of the house, at the roof, are those personal assets, those individual assets like stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. And there's a whole system that goes towards supporting these things. Now currently, the system here is not structured to actually provide those progressive assets and benefits for some. Now it does quite well for those who are wealthy, for those who work in professional service jobs, for those who already have. As you well know, the tax structure as it currently stands is very generous to people who already have, and it helps them even more. And so when you come to look at how the asset building structure works for lower income populations, you actually realize that there's a great disparity and that we need to change it. And that's why I put progressive in front of all these policies, because in order to change it, we need to be thinking about progressive policy designs that actually are inclusive of all populations.
You mean progressive like a progressive income tax, or?
I mean progressive as in
As
with...
a new name for liberal.
No. Like a progressive like
Yeah.
Social Security is progressive, where
Like-
lower income populations get more than higher income populations.
And in education, it would be people with demonstrated need pay less tuition, and
That's
people
right.
with
Those kinds of
means
progressive.
testing a lot of things.
Those kinds. Actually, let me say this: I don't believe in means testing when it comes to Social Security. I don't believe in it. If you pay, you should be able to get out. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't design the policy in a way that higher net worth people pay in more, but get out less. But they should be able to get out, because that's the nature of insurance. That's why you buy homeowners insurance. That's why you buy car insurance, just in case something happens. Now, just think about all of the Bernie Madoff people. Multi-millionaires one day, the next day destitute. If Social Security wasn't there, they'd have nothing. It's an insurance program, a social insurance program. So, in terms of our recommendations for the larger racial wealth gap issue, jobs are important. Financial services don't need to be, we need to make sure they're not exploitive. Housing policy needs to be much better. Entrepreneurship needs to be more accessible, particularly to younger children and adults. More investments in kids. Making tax policy fair. But retirement security for all is critically important to this equation, and Social Security is especially important. And so are targeted policy strategies that actually support asset building in low wealth households. And with regards to retirement security for all, a couple of years ago, we convened, I was the co-director of this thing called the Commission to Modernize Social Security. And we came up with a plan for how we would actually close the solvency gap in Social Security while also actually strengthening benefits for vulnerable populations. And we've updated the numbers since, but we're still in the black. There is a way to do this, folks, that most of the mainstream pundits and policymakers are not talking about, although you now hear a contingent of U.S. senators like Senator Warren, Harkin, and others, Bernie Sanders and others, talking about strengthening and expanding Social Security. In fact, that's what I'll be talking about tomorrow at the U.S. Senate Finance Committee about how we do that. And so with this, there are things that you can do to raise revenue. And one of the biggest revenue raisers for actually strengthening or closing Social Security solvency gap is actually eliminating the cap or partially eliminating the cap on wages. How many of you know that there is a cap on wages?
You're
Yeah,
talking about the cap beyond which you don't have to contribute.
that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Once you've given a certain amount
Right.
in a given year, then
It's 112 grand or something.
It's
like that, right?
about 113,000 now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you're making more than you only pay Social Security taxes on your first $113,000, which means that Bill Gates and Oprah and all those folks, probably by the time they blink after midnight on the first day of the year, they pay their Social Security taxes. And so, you know, many of us have argued that we need to lift the cap. Now, our commission said lift the cap completely. There is no cap on Medicare's contribution. And some say, okay, let's just lift it to 250,000 or whatever. I mean, it's really, you know, it depends on what your perspective is. But that literally by itself solves the 75-year gap. It extends the solvency of Social Security for an additional 75 years, which is the actuarial period needed in order to for the Social Security actuaries to say that that the program is solvent.
When was the last time that cap was lifted?
It goes up gradually every year, but the formula is such that it has not kept pace with.
So that's been there since the act, Social Security was introduced.
I don't know when it was introduced, but it's been there for years.
Benefits also increase faster than inflation because they're based on wages instead of CPI. Is that one of your recommendations? That's one that's been out there a long time.
Where are you?
To change the formula.
Oh yeah. We argue for, and I don't think that we put it in here, but we argue that we need to be using the CPIE, which is the Consumer Price Index formula for elderly. We currently use, as a nation, we use the COLA is actually determined by the CPIW, which is the Consumer Price Index for workers. And that particular formula doesn't actually address the higher costs that seniors actually experience when it comes to healthcare costs. And so the CPI, the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, has been using this experimental measure of the CPIE for a number of years. And they show that on an annual basis, the CPIE version would be about 2 percentage points to 3 percentage points higher than the CPIW version of the formula.
Obama talking about that. He's talking about using COLA.
So it's actually worse than that. Obama was actually talking about using the chain CPI, which would have been a benefit cut, which would have hurt the very populations that I'm talking about today. Now, I wrote a policy brief where I said Obama basically puts the African Americans back in chains. I don't think they appreciated that up to the White House. And then they backed off. And I think they actually backed off because they couldn't get it through. The Republicans were obstructionists. We were happy that the Republicans were obstructionists in this case because it actually saved many moderate and low-income families from getting a big hit. And it's been sad that for much of the first term we have had to work against the grand bargain that they were intent on focusing on, which really would have hurt it would have shifted the costs of deficit reduction to middle class and working class people. And we had a Democratic president who was on board with that agenda. So anyway, there is a way to actually strengthen Social Security. There's a way to pay for it. This is the way to do it. There are other plans that are out there. But we're actually arguing that we need to actually strengthen the Social Security program. It's a backbone and will continue to be a backbone of retirement security in America. And we can't ignore that fact. We can't privatize the system, and we can't and shouldn't be considering reducing benefits because this is literally something that more and more workers are going to rely on for their retirement needs in the future. So with that, I'd love to engage in any other questions, anything you'd like to engage me in. Yeah.
You had a couple slides back about the recommendations for increasing access to financial institutions. I was just curious what the details were. It was like 3 or 4 slides back.
Yeah, fair financial services.
Yeah.
So, remember the retirement, the checking account numbers that I showed you. And so there's a whole body of work out there by various think tanks and others who have been looking at how to actually pressure the private sector banking industry to actually provide more affordable banking products that actually meet the needs of lower income populations.
Do you address the payday lending industry in any of your recommendations?
Yeah, so we don't. So our idea is that if you actually increase access to fair and affordable financial services, that you then drive payday lenders out of business. Now we do talk about how payday lending is basically a wealth stripper for our communities, and how the usury rates that many of them charge is actually unfair, and that we need to increase access to fairer services.
So your address to that is not addressing regulating payday lenders, it's opening access to traditional banking.
And also, of course, strengthening CFPB to go after those unsavory actors. And frankly, while we didn't specify it in our report, we are on board with regulating those actors more at the state level and the federal level.
Do you do any survey? I can't get unstuck on the cultural background and attitudes.
Yeah.
In San Diego, if you're a landlord and most of your tenants are white, you require automatic deductions to pay rent, and everybody's fine with it. If you're a landlord in a Latino neighborhood, you understand that you're going to have to go get your rent in cash, and even getting them to use money orders or checks, because that culture doesn't trust banks and they don't use banks. My family's Scotch-Irish. The Scots in our family are really frugal. The Irish are heavily in debt. Chinese people have really high savings rates. So, because I love what you said about we have to write about racial differences, and media people are usually well-educated whites, and we're afraid to talk about it because are we preaching? How would we know? That kind of thing. So, is there data that we can actually move beyond stereotypes and say yes, Jews and Chinese save at really high rates for the following reasons? African Americans don't because of the sharecropper tradition that lasted all the way up to the 60s. Read The Promised Land by Nicholas Lehman.
I have not seen a survey that actually says why. I have seen the surveys that show the differentials,
That will show the attitudes.
That show the differentials in savings and
That's the
participation.
outcome, though.
But in terms of attitudes, who does
Because I don't know
that?
if a bank is redlining, or I don't know if a community is refusing to put their money into the checking account.
So what we do know about checking accounts, and Demos is good on some of their data, would be good to look at, is that when you're bouncing checks, because that the fees on those bounce checks are untenable, and these folks end up getting out of the banking system. We also know that the garnishment of checking accounts has been an issue in low-income populations, particularly among black men who are seeking to escape garnishment of child support and other things. And so there are different issues that are facing these populations. We know that in the Latino community, documentation it keeps folks from getting access to a checking account. And so, you have different factors that are telling the stories in different ways. Another, NCLR did a big report on this last year, the National Council of La Raza, that looked at financial access and the unbanked, underbanked, unhappily banked in the Latino community.
But Bank of America has done masses with that stuff because they're dealing so often with the immigrant population and trying to figure out how to bank them in order to get them to be sending remittances home. But I bet Pew Hispanic would also be, they work a lot with NCLR.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the first speaker we had was a credential talking about cultural differences and preparedness for retirement, and didn't discuss income. So it's completely different. And you're talking about culture, and yet what you're talking about is not necessarily, this goes back to sharecroppers, or these are very real, concrete problems that exist now. And I think too often we're looking at culture in the wrong way. You know what I mean? That we're looking for cultural answers in the wrong place, or to differentiate races. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I hear you. So that, it's not necessarily attitudes passed down through generations, that it's actually challenges and barriers that are facing, or behaviors that are facing populations today,
Right.
that actually serve
That
as barriers to.
it's not reported on enough. I think it's easier to make it sound.
Well, it's
Well,
both
that's-
though.
yeah,
I grew up in the South, and I knew people who had to leave high school and work
Right.
because their fathers said that's book learning, and that's less
Right.
important than
No, it's
draining
both.
oil
It's
at the
not-
family company's trucks.
Well,
And I knew African American families who grew up in a sharecropper system, and their grandfather, their great-grandfather, and their fathers all said, if you build something and save something, some corrupt white guy is going to take it away. So you might as well save it, you might as well hide it in cash, you might as well buy jewelry, because you are stupid
But I think if we don't
if you
address,
save money.
I think that's true. Of course, I don't think
Now,
it's
that's
one
anecdotal, but
No, I don't think it's one or the other. But I think if we don't address the really, in my opinion, obviously, the media doesn't address the very real barriers that either are deliberate or de facto or
Yeah,
not,
and some of
know.
these stories, I mean, you hear anecdotally, right? The story I heard of a story of a man putting his savings in his sister's account because any savings he had were subject to garnishment.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Mhm.
much. But I know that, Julia. I understand a lot of this is focused on the issue about Social Security, but what about, I wonder how to write about people. We often write about how you save for retirement, how you save, and you're basically saying you can't save. This population can't because the money isn't there. So how do you write about this aside from Social Security, about low-income workers and retirement?
Yeah.
I think one example is just what the levy fee is at these banks, like Wells Fargo, $125 every month. Someone tries to garnish the account, so that's like $125 monthly fee on your checking account if you have one that they're hitting you with, going right into negative balances.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you've got the hold policies, which is you don't know what the hold is until you deposit the check, you could be bouncing checks without realizing it because you thought you made a good deposit.
So this issue of cash is an important part of the story. The fact that these populations lack cash, a checking account almost makes no sense if you have a fee attached to it. If you're going to bounce something and the fee of the bounce is going to take your $25. And in that case, in some respects it's twisted, but the check cashing places, obviously they know the population, and the structure of their services are such that meets the needs of this population. Now, it doesn't meet them in terms of the usury rates, because it ends up actually being a trap for many of these folks. But banks are I think now beginning to innovate around this. They're thinking about it seriously, and looking at and the Postal Service is even talking about how do you actually expand access to affordable and fair financial services for those who are unbanked, underbanked, or unhappily banked.
I think looking for unintended consequences is a rich vein. For example, and there's some neighborhoods that I cover that are, one in particular is full of people from Oaxaca, and it's first, second, third generation. And to build wealth and save money, they think nothing of putting a family of 6, 7, or 8 people into a 1-bedroom apartment. And if you offer them a 2-bedroom apartment that's only a couple $100 more, they'll look at you like you're crazy and say, why would I pay $1,100 a month when I can be in a 1-bedroom for $900? That would be stupid and crazy. And then you go to the city council and they say, oh my God, isn't it terrible? We have a Latino family, 6 people, two parents and 4 kids and grandma and grandpa, 8 people living in a 1-bedroom. That's overcrowding. We're going to outlaw it. And this is a wealth building strategy that has to do with zoning. It has to do with a alleged public safety issue. And I guess it's what you're saying. Get out of the cocktail party and into the community and understand the community and understand what their incentives are, what their values are, and what kind of obstacles they face. Because if they're hiding every time the city code enforcement comes through, they want their landlord to fix something, but if code enforcement comes, they're going to make me get rid of my teenagers because I'm allegedly overcrowded. Well, I had to, you know.
The answer was there all the time.
But these are the things that. Oh, sorry. Did I interrupt somebody?
Go ahead, and then
I work at the Inter-American Development Bank in Communications, and I've worked most of my reporting career in the developing world. And I just showed a video a week and a half ago to a bunch of students on reproductive health and the big family population issues in Kenya, right? And if you tell people we're going to outlaw polygamy, or like Kenya actually just legalized it, or you come at people from a religious or cultural perspective, that you're not going to get anywhere. You have to, as the population reporter said, you have to ask the right questions. Do you know how you're going to support this many people? Do you know what the benefits would be if you had less kids? And so coming at everything from, but in my perspective as an anthropologist, most cultural behaviors are based on logistical concerns, and those concerns change over time. But one of the things that we do at the IDB is look at women in banking, and we also look at minority and banking, the unbanked, and all this stuff. But they've found by and large through surveys that women are completely put off by pink credit cards and things that were made to make women feel more feminine, and that women, what they really want are more time spent in the bank having real conversations where they're addressing their real logistical problems. And that these are the things, so not only as journalists but people working in the marketing industry have to get their head around our stereotypes versus the logistical reasons that certain things happened in a certain way, or certain cultural stereotypes even started. I don't know if that made me sense.
yeah, that's deep.
Also, I wanted to switch on the topic a little bit, if you don't mind, because you're here. I'm from Detroit, and you mentioned the public pension.
Yeah.
Is your group weighing in on that?
We haven't. We think that that it was sad that we were looking at making the creditors whole and not considering the pensioners, legitimate creditors in terms of being first position to get paid, especially since those retirees and near retirees had been keeping the city going. They had provided a service to the city, and then to have the value of their pensions drop overnight through an adjudicated process is a slap in the face. And so, but I was encouraged that that the Wall Street crowd got a hit too. But the issue is that we need to. These are people who work long and hard for not a lot of pay. And they need the support that their pension, they were depending on the support that their pensions were going to provide. We need to make sure that that doesn't happen in any more cities in America. And while we have not weighed in, we think that it's important to make sure that pensioners are made whole, and that they should be in first position before the Wall Street crowd.
I wanted to comment.
Oh, yeah. No, go ahead. I'm sorry, you did speak out, and then I'll go to you.
Dan, I mean, my experience when I came and I was a child, not only did I live with both sets of grandparents, as my family, the few that had remained in Cuba after 1960-61, they would come to Miami and everybody lived in one house. It was a 2-bedroom house. So, you know, we had one bathroom. There were 9 to 11 people at any time, which my children can't conceive. As you progress in economic wherewithal, I think you move forward and you don't do that. But you see it now in Miami, not necessarily with the third generation, like my children would never think of something like this. But you see it with people coming from Central America and Latin America. They bring the relatives and everybody packs up. And that's not even that uncommon anyway in Latin America. You just add on to a house.
And then the city cracks down on your renting flat.
Well,
Right.
you know, in Miami, there's this entire cash underground community where, you know, your nail person doing your nails in her garage doesn't want even a check. You pay cash. You pay for all these other services in cash, but it's mainly because of sales tax, which is a big revenue for the state. Remember, we have no income tax, and that's how they get around it.
But that is a
I'm
huge
sorry.
problem.
I'm sorry, she was next.
Sorry.
Uh-huh.
Well, I was gonna change courses, I mean, but, like, okay.
Oh,
so-
okay. Actually, if you're going to change courses,
Okay,
did you
go
want to
ahead.
just weigh in on that last point?
No, I totally agree with what you're saying. I mean, I lived 7 years in Miami Beach in an efficiency apartment where the apartment behind us was one of those elder community, informal communities of the North, or the, yeah, except for they were all elderly Cuban ladies that had a handyman who came over and took care of them. And my building, I was the only U.S. citizen in my apartment building, and we often had Central Americans living in the apartment next door, and there were times when even the other immigrants or me who lived in the developing world would be like, oh my gosh, there's 6 of them in an efficiency apartment. But the mentality in these communities is like, and it's not just the mentality, it's like the logistics. You're always pulling yourself up, and you can't see because nobody's there. That educational component is not there to say, if you got a low interest rate loan, or if you had that access to that next step, you could get out of that and logistically be in a better place, because you're constantly falling back into it, and you're constantly going to these, this informal network, or to these check cashing places.
And by the way, it
was like a quicksand. It was like you just watch your
It's-
friends. and
it's
you can't get
structural.
out. Yeah.
It's structural, which, by the way, I haven't heard you all discuss. So I think that the personal factors and the cultural factors
No, but
are
that's
an
what you
element.
were talking about.
Yeah.
The structure. That's what I was trying to say. Looking at the
Yeah.
structure.
Uh-huh.
Well, now I have 2 questions, because thinking about the cultural differences, like, what do you do with that in, say, a financial literacy curriculum for kids? You know, how do you make it a universal sort of education when they're going home and they have all these different experiences? And my initial question was, what you showed us is that the inequality, very clear, but what does that tell us about, like, the poverty rate among seniors? And that chart that you had that said, like, 90 to 100% of these populations get the majority of their income from Social Security. All these people below the poverty line, are they all poor elderly people?
I had a slide that showed, and I didn't translate it to this particular slide, but it shows that the differential in assets among the 62 and over crowd, with by race, and you see whites doing fine, but then you see the numbers of African Americans and Latinos who rely on not just Social Security but also SSI in retirement, and that shows the poverty rate, I think, or the poverty among the seniors. And you see that Latinos lead the pack in terms of getting both Social Security and SSI, followed by African Americans. And so it tells a story that, there are some people who work for a lifetime of low wages.
Yeah.
And even when they get to retirement and get access to their Social Security benefits, it's not enough to help them get by. and then they have to rely on SSI. And you all know what SSI is. An indigent program. You only get access if you have no other assets. And so, that's a critical part of the equation. There are some people who are arguing that we need to be boosting SSI as well, and looking at it as the important program that it is, but looking at updating it. And I will be arguing tomorrow, but in my testimony, that part of the expanding of the benefits is actually making the minimum benefit of Social Security more adequate for low-income populations, so that we're actually strengthening the value of the lowest Social Security benefit for those workers who have worked for a long time at low wages. So, there are things that we need to be doing to modernize Social Security and other parts like SSI to make sure that low-income population, if you work for a lifetime, you shouldn't, it really is a sad state of affairs that even in retirement, that you are literally trying to scrape by. And then we need to make our benefits more adequate. Yeah.
Quick question on the data itself. Of the non-white populations looked at, do you know what proportion of those were immigrants, first generation immigrants?
In our data?
Yeah.
None. You mean first generation immigrants?
Yeah.
Undocumented immigrants versus.
No, because if they were undocumented,
so no.
they wouldn't be.
So I was going to say undocumented immigrants are not in the study. We did not break it down by immigration status, or first generation, second
generation.
generation.
Immigration, issues that they have.
Just following on Lindsay's, her first question about teaching financial literacy, how did you ask it? Is there the cultural component?
What do you do with that in a financial
curriculum that kids from different backgrounds can
Yeah.
So what's interesting is that, are you familiar with Ariel Capital up in Chicago? Yeah, John Rogers, Melody Hobson. They have pioneered a curriculum they've created a school that it's entirely focused around financial education and entrepreneurship. And they've pioneered a curriculum and they're working primarily with lower income African American students. To me, it would be interesting to look at their curricula and how they've adjusted it for cultural circumstances. At the same time, how much of our education system is tailored towards culture anyway? I can tell you, none of it. And so, is that a good thing? I would argue probably not, but it's what it is. And so, if it's the issue of whether or not you have culturally appropriate, age-appropriate financial education, or having financial education, period, I'd say we need financial education. It would be nice to have it culturally appropriate. But the people who do design curriculum can address that.
The miracle of compound financing works in agriculture. You show a kid, oh my God.
Yeah.
But a lot of the independent sort of financial education that happens, I don't know Ariel Capital, but is usually sponsored by financial services companies, and these are companies that have a tradition of not doing good things.
The National Council of La Raza had a proposal, and the National Urban League has joined in, and some others, that that was looking at also doing doing financial education and support services through community-based organizations, so that these organizations that understand the communities, that understand the populations, that they're more suited to actually convey.
Don't have anything to sell.
Right, and don't have anything to sell. But the problem with some of this is that there are, and some of you probably know that there is a fiduciary responsibility on certain kinds of financial advice. And so, they would either have to stay out of the realm of that kind of advice that it comes with that kind of responsibility, which, limits you to only a certain spectrum of financial education. And that might be okay.
What concerns do you have? You're actually making it look like whites are doing far better than they really are. I think your point about how the whites saw a decline in wealth while the Federal Reserve was reporting that the figures have recovered.
Well, I actually feel bad about the white situation because those numbers are skewed by the 1%. numbers are skewed by the 1% who are pretty much all white. But they're really screwing your numbers.
You have the key. Whites are broke. Minorities are beyond broke.
Right, and the fact of the matter is, and this is why, by the way, that we don't call for racialized policies. We talk about targeted, universal policies that are targeted, but none of them are race specific. Every policy that we actually call for as a recommendation will help low and moderate working income whites as well as, but you know, to us, this is a story that we need to continue to remind ourselves 50 years beyond the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That we really have not done all that much, you know, and we can't be patting ourselves on the back because the work continues, and that we need to be addressing the structural barriers that continue to provide, that continue to be a barrier for these populations as well.
Thank you.
So thank you
very much.
Uh-huh.